Good morning, church. If you would, open your Bibles to the 13th chapter of John's Gospel. John 13, looking at cross-shaped community today. And let's begin with this, that some of you maybe have read some of Stephen Covey's books, the 7 Habits books, or the First Things First book. In that First Things First book, Covey argues that it's easy for us to lose sight of what's truly important or what's most important unless we make a conscious effort to keep the main thing the main thing. Keeping the main thing the main thing. I want to begin by asking the question, what's the main thing for us as Christians? We gather together as a church. What does it mean for us to keep the main thing the main thing? And I say by way of introducing this way that what we're going to do when we look at Jesus in this text washing his disciples' feet will be him teaching a lesson about what the main thing is and imploring us as his people to follow him down that same route so that we can keep the main thing in this new community that he calls the church. As we come to this chapter in John's Gospel, we're going to find Jesus spending the last few hours before he's going to be betrayed, arrested, and ultimately crucified. He'll be hanging on a cross in less than 24 hours from this moment that we're experiencing in the text today. And he's there with his disciples, the 12. He's at a Passover meal that it's during one of the 3 main feasts that the Jewish calendar had each year. He's there at the Passover. He's arranged for his disciples to be able to eat this Passover supper with him. And he's there at the table with the 12 that have been his apostles, his closest disciples throughout his ministry. And they've come to know him as teacher, as rabbi. That was how they first came to know him. He's a rabbi that actually wanted them to be his disciples, which most of these guys thought was crazy. The teacher wants us to follow him. And they left their nets, as it says of some of them that were fishermen, and they followed Jesus. And the job of a disciple was to just follow his rabbi around and to learn his teaching and to learn his way of life and to practice it. And over the course of their experience doing that, they'd begun to know Jesus as more than just rabbi. They'd begun to know, as we talked about last week, that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so, as their understanding of Jesus grew, they began to not be able to imagine carrying on life and ministry without him, as they would shortly do. They had seen Jesus, for example, speak to wind and waves and calm a sea. They had witnessed Jesus touch people who had incurable diseases or congenital paralysis and to make them well. They had seen Jesus call Lazarus, 4 days dead, from a tomb out, and him respond, "Get up and live again." And so I'm ready to give them some space for not being able to envision what it would even mean for them to somehow carry on their master's teachings without him. How can this one die? They knew that he was the Savior of the world, the Savior of Israel, the Redeemer, the promised King. Yet they couldn't grasp that for Jesus to accomplish what he indeed came to accomplish, it would mean dying in less than 24 hours on a Roman cross. They knew the scriptures foretold that every nation on earth would have people bowing before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, this Jesus. But they just couldn't envision that would happen not by the force of military power, but by the force of his own sacrificial love. Nor could they imagine or envision the possibility that the advance of this kingdom that Jesus always talked about wouldn't mean more and more lands that they occupied, that Israel ruled over, but instead of that it would mean more and more spirit indwelt hearts that people would come to know Jesus as Lord and Savior. And so they come to this moment as his disciples, unprepared, unable to grasp what it would even mean for them to carry on once he went back, as the text says, to his Father. And so what Jesus does in this passage is he demonstrates for them what the main thing is. Here's what it's supposed to be like. Here's a vision for what you're going to do when I leave. And we're going to see Jesus calling us, his disciples, his church, to be a cross-shaped community where servant-hearted sacrificial love is our most defining feature. Let's pray together, and then we'll explore this in detail. Father, please help me to expose your scriptures faithfully today, and help each one of us to receive what you have for us with reverence and with humility. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, the first thing we see in this passage is going to be an experience, what I'm calling an experience of cross-shaped community. It begins in verse 1. The Apostle John says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." Now that's a multi-layered introduction, by the way. For those of you who maybe don't know this, John's Gospel has 21 chapters. There's 21 chapters in this book we call the Book of John, or John's Gospel. If you were to read the first 11 chapters, you would see John covering, explaining, describing what Jesus' life and ministry was like for roughly 3 years. It's about half the book. Chapter 12 begins the last week of Jesus' life before the cross, before his resurrection. But John spends no less than 8 of those last 10 chapters describing how Jesus, in his words, loved them to the end. He loved them to the end. Verse 1 is an introduction to the entire rest of the book. Everything that follows in John's Gospel from this point is Jesus loving his own who were in the world to the very end. And as we learn in John 17, he's not just talking about the 12 or perhaps others outside of this room. He's talking about all who would come to believe through their message. He's talking about us. He loves us to the very end. Now, as we come to this upper room table, the Apostle John helps us to understand some things that were going on in the room, some important context, so that we can grasp the meaning, this experience of cross-shaped community that he's going to describe. So verses 2 and 3 now sort of hone in on what's happening at the supper and the significance of the context for that we need to pick up on. He says, "During supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up." And I'm going to stop there. Those 2 verses, John lets us in onto some things that we need to understand about what was happening in the room, and more particularly what Jesus knew, in light of which he did what he did. So to summarize it, Jesus knew who he was, and he knew who he was with. He knew who he was, and he knew who he was with. He knew, for example, that he was at the table with a traitor. He knew that there was a disciple, a man at the table, with whom he'd spent much of the last 3 years in close fellowship, working together, had loved this man, had honored this man, had called him to a special place of service, and yet he knew that at the table sat one who had already put into works a plot, a plan that would result in Jesus' arrest later that night, and had done so for 30 pieces of silver. He knew he was at the table with 11 others who were more concerned about which of them was second in command than they were about what Jesus had been saying continuously about the significance of this Passover and about where he was headed. Jesus not only knew who he was with, he knew who he was in that moment. He knew his own divine identity. He knew his own divine authority. He knew, for example, that if he wanted, he could call 10,000 angels to his side and deal with any problem that he might face. And I doubt there's anyone in the room that thinks if Jesus had so intended, that he couldn't outmaneuver Judas, right? Clearly, Jesus knew who he was with, and he knew who he was. He's not acting out of compulsion, out of some kind of necessity. As he says earlier in this gospel, nobody takes my life from me. I lay my life down. And Jesus knew he had come to die for the sins of his people and that he would become the ultimate Passover lamb whose sacrificial death would save his people. And it's at this point, recognizing that Jesus knew who he was and who he was with, that we can see that sacrificial love like his is not for dupes. It's not for people that are just easily used. Sacrificial love is for people who know God and who know who they are as a result of their relationship with God, and who know the cross-shaped life and community that Jesus has called them to. That's who sacrificial love is for. See, Jesus chose to love people like this, and yes, people like us, knowing all these things. He chose to build this cross-shaped community out of people like us on the foundation of his own cross-shaped love for us. And so John says in verse 4 that he got up from the supper and he laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Now, I love what John does in the way that he describes this, because he wants for us to get in our mind's eye the scene that's happening, not just to sort of read it and know the facts, but to in some sense be present for what's happening. And by the way, on April 10th, when we do this service where we're focused around the Lord's Supper for the entirety of the service, that's what I'm hoping will happen. I'm hoping that we will do more than just sort of know about it, but that we could, in some sense, be there at the table, at that supper, and participate. And that's what John does. He does it with these staccato verbs. He got up, he laid aside, he took a towel, he girded himself, he went to the basin, he poured water. He's doing that to help us to see, to be there, to see in our mind's eye Jesus getting up from the head of the table, taking off his outer garment like he's about to go to work, picking up a towel and wrapping it around his waist, and us recognizing that that's the way that servants typically look. And going to this basin and pouring water in it and wondering, what is he going to do next? What's happening right now? And then as he comes before the first of the disciples and he kneels before them, and he takes one of their feet and he begins to clean and to wipe and to proceed from one disciple to the next, from one dirty foot to the next, until he had washed the feet of all of his disciples. And being there, at least in our mind's eye, we can wonder the same thing that the 12 wondered. What in the world is going on? What's happening right now? And Peter wants to know that, and that's where the text will go next. But before we get to Peter's response, there are a few more things that it might be helpful for us to know about what was happening, some cultural things that aren't quite the same as what we experience in our culture. I caught a glimpse of this, and some of you have probably done this before, but with overseas travel. I've been to South Sudan a number of times and have been in a place where everywhere you go, you're walking down. There are no paved roads. You're walking at best on a dusty sort of dirt road, and in other places you wouldn't call it a road. It's muddy And it's the same path that all the livestock travel, so there's that. So somebody just, nope. So you can imagine in your sandals, which we did wear, the state of your feet at the end of the day, right? And the need to take those off, by the way, before you come in the house. So that's different, a little bit different than where we live. But what you might not know also is that in terms of a meal like this was probably the closest thing we have would be like Christmas dinner. Although this was more elaborate. This is a dinner that probably would have taken hours just on a typical celebration, 4 or 5 hours, with different ritual elements and different parts of fellowship that are happening all around. It's not just you showed up and you ate and you left. And so you can imagine, Christmas dinner, people are coming over and guests, family and friends, and they're coming over to your house, and there's an expectation of hospitality. One of the things that was customary in a situation like this would be for the host to provide for people to wash their feet when they came. And if you were a well-to-do person, you had servants or slaves, you would provide a servant to do that. In other circumstances, you might, if you didn't have that, you might provide one of your children. That would be their job. That's what you're going to do today for dinner, right? All the kids in the room are like, man, glad I live in the 21st century. But at the very least, you would provide for a towel and a base, the water and the towel for people to be able to do for themselves. And so you got these disciples sitting at the table, and this has just gone undone. It's just, and like you would do, you perhaps politely overlook the faux pas or whatever, you wonder, and you just, and so dinners, they've sat down at some point, they've sat down to the table, and then Jesus gets up. He proceeds in this way. Now, before we go to Peter's response, I want to highlight that what Jesus is doing here is he's showing hospitality. He's honoring his disciples by serving them, by caring for their need. That's how a cross-shaped community shows love, by extending hospitality, by meeting people at their need, by honoring guests. And I see that in our church, and I every Sunday morning, for example, and I could name so many different people, but I'll come in this way and I'll see Roger Douglas out making coffee so that all of us have coffee to drink. And I see lots of things happen. In the first hour, Blake Blanchard was sitting right there, and I call her Saint Beth of the Snotty Nose. Beth Blanchard is our preschool director. And that she gets that name honestly, if it's because unlike me, when a child sneezes and I'm like, ducking and dodging and blocking, she extended her hand one time and caught the sneeze from this child. And you think, that's this. That's cross-shaped community. That's love. That's care. And it happens every week all across our church. And what I want to say, man, is that's the main thing. Let's keep that the main thing. Let's press into that as we go forward together. But becoming a cross-shaped community isn't without its challenges. It's so countercultural and so counter to normal human patterns of behavior and desires that it does invite resistance. And so that's what Peter's going to do here. He's going to resist. And so let's read his reaction. Verse 6, so Jesus, he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered and said to him, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. Peter said to him, never shall you wash my feet. I always loved Peter. because it's intensity. Whichever, he's going this direction, it's intense, and he can turn the next moment this direction, it'll still be intense. So it's all, never shall you wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. Now, I want to just pause to acknowledge that there are two threads running through John 13. One is Jesus' sacrificial love for his disciples, and the other is Judas' betrayal. And what we're going to do today is we're going to leave this off to the side. I'm going to follow this thread all the way through and not deal with this. So we're just going to leave that and focus on this thread. Okay. So we got Peter's reaction. Never shall you wash my feet. You could translate the underlying Greek, I think even more accurately for us by saying, never in a million years. That's how we would say it. Not in a million years will I let you wash my feet. Well, why? Again, it isn't a cultural. It's not. Peter's perfectly comfortable with having his feet washed. That's normal custom. It's needed here. What's his problem? What's he reacting to? What's he protesting? Lord, do you wash my feet? That's the problem. You're going to wash my feet? See, that's the kind of job a slave or a servant does. You're teacher and Lord. You're going to wash my feet? That's not the job of the slave or the master to wash the feet of the slave. It's not the job of the disciple to wash the feet of the rabbi, or vice versa. You see, Peter can't believe that someone who's superior, that someone with greatness or power would serve him in that way. Certainly all he's ever seen is that people with greatness and power and authority, they don't serve, they're served. In fact, probably he thinks that's the way it should be. And aren't we so inclined to power, at least in part, because we'd rather be served than to serve? You know what Jesus is saying to this community of disciples who are really concerned about who's next in command? Not so among you. Not so among you. Not so in my cross-shaped community. And I want you to think about this word community. Communion. So you can't get to communion with anybody by force. You can't compel people to love one another. Love doesn't work like that. When we use greatness or power or authority, whether it's physical strength, whether it's economic power, whether it's physical or spiritual power, whatever we use. When we use that to coerce, community suffers. Jesus is building community. Jesus' response is a little cryptic, but effectively what he's saying here is Peter, if you're scandalized by the idea that I would serve you in washing your feet, you don't have any idea. I mean, you don't realize what I'm working on right now. See, because this foot washing, this is just a symbol. The substance is coming tomorrow. And that's why he responds, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. It's a foretaste of the greatest act of self-abasement, of humble, sacrificial, love-motivated service in history. The foot washing is just a foretaste of what's coming on that cross. Jesus said in Mark 10:45, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. There's no dirty foot that can hold a candle to the condition of our souls. No foot washing that could compare to the length to which Jesus went on a cross to cleanse us. And he tells Peter the same thing that he tells to all of us. If you would be in communion with me, I need to wash you. And if you're here and you've never been cleansed by Jesus, Ask him to cleanse you. It's our faith in Jesus as he's died on the cross for us. That's the way he cleanses us. That's the way we come to have a part with him. And if you've never let him wash you, I urge you today, ask him to make you clean, and you'll be clean. Now, lastly, what we find in this passage, we've had an experience of cross-shaped community, we've had resistance to cross-shaped community, and now we're going to have instruction for cross-shaped community. Look at the last part of the text, beginning in verse 12. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, "Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Now, I'm going to skip down the page because what's going to follow this part is more of the Judas betrayal thread. I want to skip down to where Jesus sort of completes the thought of this main thing that he's been showing them through washing their feet. We'll pick up in verse 33. "Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I say also to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, this kind of servant-hearted, cross-shaped love is to be the defining feature of the church I'm building, says Jesus. And it's an important lesson because these disciples, in the day that they lived, they were used to rabbi with his disciples. You learn the teaching of your rabbi, you adopt his way of life, and they'd seen some examples that Jesus did not want them to recreate. They'd seen scribes and Pharisees who were often in Jesus's teaching crosshairs, let's say, who were masters at keeping everything but the main thing, the main thing. Their great teachers had disciples who learned to wield the Bible and to wield their spiritual authority, their position of influence, in ways that built their own greatness. And Jesus says, "I'm giving you a new commandment. I want you to adopt my way of life. I want you to love each other the way that I have loved you. People will recognize that you're my disciples, if they see that you love the way that I love. That's my way of life." Now, years ago, I read a book written by Tim Keller called Every Good Endeavor. The aim of the book is to ask and attempt to answer the question, okay, so I'm a Christian, how does that affect my vocation, my work, right? At the risk of oversimplifying, does that mean that occasionally I share the gospel with my coworkers? Maybe I pray for them. Is there anything more? What does it mean that I'm a Christian with respect to my vocation? That's the idea in the book. And in the book, he gives a wonderful example, tells a story about a woman that had come into his church when it was fairly young, new church in Manhattan. And he would see this, as he's preaching, he'd see this woman out there and recognize, I don't know her. She's been coming the last couple of weeks, but I've never had the chance to sort of catch her because she leaves really quickly after the service. And he's thinking this through and finally intercepts her one Sunday before she can get out the door to greet her and try to get to know who she is. And as he catches her, he's asking her about coming to Redeemer. She says, well, I don't believe in Christianity at this point, but I'm exploring it. I find a lot of it interesting. And so he presses further. And, well, how'd you hear about Redeemer? And why are you interested? And she tells this story about her experience at work. She worked for a company there in Manhattan, and she had made a big mistake that was going to be a job-ending, career-ending sort of. She'd made a big mistake. She was going to lose her job. But her supervisor went to his supervisor, and the mistake that she made, he took complete responsibility for it, lost credibility, lost some mobility in the organization, but kept her from losing her job. And she goes to him after this and she says, I've had bosses who took credit for my accomplishments before. I've never had a boss take credit for a mistake, much less a big mistake like this. Why did you do that? And initially he was sort of, self-deferential, but she kept pressing, and he said, well, I'm a Christian. And among other things, what that means is that Jesus took the blame for me. He took my failure on himself. And because of that, I have the desire and sometimes the ability to do the same for others. And she stares back at him for a moment and says, where do you go to church? That's how she ended up at Redeemer. And I submit to you, that's cross-shaped community. And she came into the church and was eventually transformed. She eventually became a Christian through that experience. But that's what cross-shaped community looks like. See, a cross-shaped community receives Jesus' own cross-shaped love and in turn loves others with it. Cross-shaped community adopts Jesus' way of life, his values, and carries them where it goes. In a cross-shaped community, leaders are known for their humility and their goodness, not by their power and position. Servant-hearted sacrificial love is the most defining feature of a cross-shaped community. And as I read this text, I think I have so much to grow in this. And we just have to press on, brothers and sisters, in this direction. This is the main thing. This is what Jesus is calling us to. Let's press on in it. In verse 17, he says, if you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. We know these things. Since you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. God's blessing of our church and of our lives, brothers and sisters, it doesn't depend on us developing some innovative strategy for how we're going to get ahead or how our church is going to. It's not that. God already has a strategy for us. He already has a plan. He already has a way. It's this. It's this right here. If we make disciples who love one another just as Jesus loved us. Now we have opportunity, brothers and sisters, to turn the most destructive dynamics at work in our homes, at work on the ball field, in our places of employment. We have the opportunity to turn destructive dynamics upside down the way that Jesus does with cross-shaped community. We have the opportunity right now in this week to think about how Jesus' love, how we can extend that in some way to someone, how we can do what Jesus did, who loved his own who were in the world to the uttermost. And so as we come to this time where we reflect and respond, I encourage you to continue in that spirit, praying, God, how would you have me to keep that servant-hearted sacrificial love the main thing in my life this week? Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this day. Oh Lord, how much we need you, how much I needed this. I trust that brothers and sisters of mine needed this. Help us to keep the main thing the main thing. Lord, as we rise in a few moments and sing and pray and reflect and respond, do something beautiful in us. Work in our midst. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.